So first of all, I want to thank Helen for the opportunity to present to you today in this amazing conference. A few months ago, Helen posted a video on her YouTube channel where she said she was combusting with excitement. And that excitement was contagious. That was at the time when I decided to come in person. I was less excited when I had to book flights and remembered how far away these two countries are from each other. But I didn't want to begin without acknowledging all the hard work that Helen and Rachel put towards this conference and just their ongoing commitment to create and grow this excellent research community. And thank you very much, Helen. I really appreciate it. Thanks. I want to say to my UK-based colleagues, I stand in solidarity with you and all the sacrifices you've had to make over the past 12 months at least to create a better higher education system in this country. And so thanks for being here, even during those difficult times. So I've got notes because I don't trust my tired self, but if you hear me mentioning any names or references, I can share them with you later, or you can email me from Friday. Just give me time to get back home. And I'm very happy to share those resources with you. So don't worry if you don't catch everything. I wanted to show you a couple of pictures of the area where I live and work, which is on colonized and unceded land, also known as Sydney in so-called Australia. This is Coogee Beach, where my daughter and my daughter's here. We love enjoying the beautiful and warm Australian weather. I get to enjoy living and working on this land because of the custodianship of the traditional owners, who are the Bejigal people of the Eora Nation. But Australia also means genocide, violence, ongoing violence, humiliation, and dispossession of the rightful owners of the land, who are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. As the oldest continuing living culture on the planet, they have survived and are still here despite ongoing institutional and epistemic violence and deep-seated racism. So sovereignty was never ceded. There was no consent, no treaty, and no compensation. So where I currently live, I'm an uninvited migrant settler on Aboriginal land, and I acknowledge the benefits that accrue to me because of my privileges. I also acknowledge any First Nations or Indigenous person who's here with us today. As a researcher, I'm conscious of our collective responsibility and our moral obligation to work in ways that are not complicit with ongoing colonization, even though, and especially because we use creative methods. This is why I chose to focus on interrogating that complicity with colonial research structures for today. So perhaps when you saw the title of my address, you thought, could be interesting, but it doesn't really concern me directly. I don't do decolonial work. I'm not Indigenous. I'm not Black, and so on. Let me be clear on one point from the beginning. This issue is everyone's responsibility. So today we are going to talk about being disruptive. And by that, I mean being disobedient and unfaithful. So what better group than those of us who use creative research methods and already do things differently, and who must contend with explaining why we do things differently and often go against the norm to do meaningful and ethical research. But before we get on to that, I want to go through a few key points about decolonizing research so that we're on the same page. Why? Because even when we use intersectional or feminist or queer or decolonial or creative methods that seek to destabilize research norms, we can still perpetuate the same power structures that these approaches claim to challenge. So I use the term decolonization, even though I increasingly refer to my work as anti-colonial, because I don't want to dilute or weaken the initial and emancipatory intent of the term decolonization, which is about the ongoing fight for self-determination and for returning land to First Nations peoples and revaluing Indigenous way of life and ways of knowing, being, and doing. So I first draw on the work of Dr. Mike Mazzoni and Professor Maggie Walter, who are Palawa or First Nations people from the state of Tasmania. So first, we must recognize the colonial and racist roots that inform our respective disciplines, which means that to this day, Western-centric research approaches are dominant. I think here of Maori scholar, Professor Linda Tuiwai-Smith's invitation to decolonize our minds. Otherwise, how is it possible for us to engage in decolonial practices? The work that goes towards ensuring we use creative research methodologies in ethical ways must include this interrogation of what discipline each method comes from, what values informed its creation and development over time, and more importantly, what still needs changing. Now, many of us are employed by academic institutions, and by virtue of being part of such institutions, built as sites that serve the colonial project and that predominantly value Eurocentric and North American-centric approaches to knowledge production, we are continuously bound by colonial ways of being, doing, and thinking. This is especially so in white majority countries, but also elsewhere. We are consciously or unconsciously reproducing these colonial and racist practices within and outside academic institutions. This is why this process of interrogation has to be reflexive and ongoing. To decolonize our minds, we must unlearn what is familiar to us through the way we were brought up and taught at university and receive training and supervision. And we must learn new ways to disconnect from colonial and racist epistemologies to keep research ethical. Overt discriminatory practices and prejudices are probably easier to identify and address. What is more difficult, and this is where commitments to decolonization can turn out to be weak and tokenistic, is when discriminatory practices and ideologies seep through a series of microaggressions, small exclusionary practices, half jokes, and insensitive research approaches that no one questions. Creative methodologies are not immune to these practices unless there is an explicit commitment to identify and eliminate them. We can't go anywhere near reconfiguring how we do research until we do this preliminary work. Only then can we understand the value of Indigenous knowledge system and majority world knowledges and approaches to dismantle the structures of domination and exploitation with creative methods as a key tool for this purpose. Especially when we use arts-based methods in contexts where the arts remain elitist and exclusionary, we must think about the impact of bringing such methods in conversation with a decolonial agenda. So in my work, I talk about the concept of cultural safety in research. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, cultural safety is a concept from Aotearoa, New Zealand, which came from transcultural nursing in response to racist practices. Dr. Irapiri Ramsden was the scholar who outlined this concept for us to build from. In a research context, cultural safety means that it's up to participants or co-researchers to decide whether a project, the research questions and aims, the methodology, the knowledge sharing strategy, and the research team feel safe. And by safety, I mean an environment where their cultural frames of reference are recentered and revalued rather than dismissed as unimportant or diminished. Ethical research means culturally safe research. So the challenge is, how do we pay more attention to cultural safety in research? What needs to change so that we don't replicate colonial and racist values in the way we use creative methods? So this framework by Gazzoni and Walter can act as a useful reminder of what we need to consider when improving our research practices: cognition, commitment, and conduct. And so that's where the changes in practice is where we can link to the potential of creative methods as tools to disrupt practices that continue to center Eurocentric and North American-centric perspectives and approaches. I would probably add to this a fourth C, which is to always challenge when you come across behaviors and research practices that reflect colonial and racist values. I don't mean once in a while or sometimes, I mean always. This is why this work is difficult and exhausting, and it comes at great cost to those who dare to imagine a different academy or research community, and who cannot practice in any other way than in alignment with decolonial values. So this paradigm shift towards cultural safety, it's not an option, it's a necessity. I don't want you to agree with me here today and then go home and never think about decolonial values ever again. I want you to honestly evaluate the way you engage in creative research right now and what needs to change or needs a complete rethink. I'm not asking this as a favor for when you have time or when you get your next job. What I'm saying is that if you do not interrogate your practices and make those changes now, you might be reinforcing or continuing to perpetuate the very structures we are seeking to destabilize with creative research. Being a researcher is an immense privilege. Why would we continue to validate practices that reinforce colonial and racist structures and hurt people in the process when we have the opportunity to disrupt the status quo? So another question we might ask ourselves is, what does it mean to imagine a new anti-colonial world from within your discipline? What does it mean to imagine a new anti-colonial world? I've just completed work towards creating an anti-colonial research library, which is an online repository of resources with practical examples of Indigenous, decolonial, and anti-colonial practices. I'll share the link in a few weeks' time on the platform formerly known as Twitter. So this library will host open access articles and books, websites, YouTube videos, etc. So there are over 400 resources in total. In the process of finding resources for this library, I can't say that I was overwhelmed by an abundance of anti-colonial research practices that involve creative methods. There were only a few such publications. And so maybe part of the problem is that the decolonial potential of creative methods is seen as a separate issue, not a central or intersecting concern. And that's something I'd like to see change. So I can give you a few examples of the resources that do address that intersection. The book by Tina Sepala and colleagues, 2021, called Arts-Based Methods for Decolonizing Participatory Research. And then a few 2022 journal articles. Jennifer Frikas on anti-colonial photo voice, excellent paper. Salah Arusi and colleagues on using body mapping to explore violent extremism in Kenya. Teresi Vunidilo's work on climate change awareness and Itokai or Indigenous Fijian responses through Indigenous knowledge sharing. Or Dr. Laurie Chambers, who is a Canadian researcher of African descent, whose research is on culturally responsive poetic inquiry to interpret, represent, and retell the HIV experiences of African background women living with HIV. Coming up soon. So I'm also editing a book on anti-colonial research praxis that's due early next year. And I have the immense privilege of working with a very diverse group of Indigenous and majority world scholars from around the world. I can't even begin to tell you just how much I'm learning from this process and working with those incredible researchers. But what I want to say about some of the contributions is that the authors who use creative methods see their practices as integral to the anti-colonial agenda, not as a separate aside. So they're not separate concerns, they're actually very strongly connected. So some examples from the Philippines, a feminist photo-based method called Photocuento Kwento, Kwento. So it's a combination of the English word photo and cuento, which means story or telling a story. So the author, her name is Kyra Albiro Cagneti, and she's already published about it, and I'm happy to share some resources on the method. Another example is the method of theatre of privileged, which is influenced by theatre of the oppressed, in a London-based university to discuss decolonizing education. A final example is on the effectiveness of arts-based methods in a creative participatory research partnership with young people in South Africa that prioritizes interactions in Xhosa, the young people's first language. So also watch this space. So a couple of reminders, you will probably be familiar with that, but it's just good to sort of reiterate what we already know. All methods have limitations. A conference like this is precisely the space where we discuss the potential problems with creative methods without fear of judgment, but with a genuine commitment to doing things better. We shouldn't come here or go to conferences in general just to pat ourselves on the back. But I think there's a general reticence to discuss and write about problems with methods, the methods that we use. And I would encourage all of you to systematically address this issue in your future publications. This is feedback I consistently provide on articles that I review. Just know awareness of the potential problems and how you address it in your practice. So for many years, I myself was writing about digital storytelling in uncritical ways, because it was during an era where our work as researchers who use creative methods had to praise these methods to gain legitimacy in the academy. Then a colleague pointed out to me that there were problems with using Western-centric understandings of storytelling across contexts, and that digital storytelling developed from such understandings as the basis for the methodology. So the same is true for methods such as story completion. And having used this narrative method recently, it became important for me to reflect on the impact of using an approach developed in psychology and psychotherapy in Western contexts, and applying this method in a social science project seeking multiple perspectives and aiming for diversity in the participant groups' cultural and ethnic backgrounds. And we also know that all methods are political. For example, the vast body of literature on photography and filmmaking clearly describes how visual methods can convey specific sociocultural and political messages based on the researchers or the funders or the institutional agendas. These might not always align with the agendas of people at the center of research. This is the kind of legacy from colonial approaches in disciplines such as anthropology that have used photography and filmmaking in harmful and racist ways for decades to serve colonial agendas. This issue links to broader discussions on Western-based researchers collecting data in countries other than their own, often in the majority world, and who then use photography and filmmaking to share findings with Western audiences only. What are the political implications of editing and curating visual data when it's not possible for participants or co-creators of knowledge to add their own narratives and perspectives because they are simply not there when the outputs are shared? There are many excellent examples of researchers challenging these approaches in visual research. I'm thinking here of the work of my colleagues, Professor Erminia Colucci, who's based at Middlesex, Dr. Caitlin Nunn, who's based at MMU here. And if you've been to the museum, you might have seen the exhibition Ancient History, Contemporary Belonging. So that's one that Caitlin was involved in, which is excellent. And Irene Gutierrez, who's here, and her colleagues at Real Borders, who do amazing work sharing findings from visual research in close collaboration with participants in different locations. There are others, I'm sure, who adopt such ethical approaches, but perhaps still in the minority. So we all have the potential to cause harm if we are not reflexive about the way we use creative methods. That includes me. That includes all of us here and online. So remember that I said that today was about being disobedient, a word that's most often associated with children as a reprimand for bad behavior. Disobedience usually also means repercussions and punishment, something many of you have probably already experienced for doing research differently. So repercussions are expected when we are creative in research contexts that value and glorify structure and repetition. Here I'm thinking about Walter Mignolo's concept of epistemic disobedience. So to disobey can actually be quite straightforward. Let me explain why I think that. Once you know that you cannot practice in any other way than in alignment with decolonial values, you will become more aware of all the instances, and there are many on a weekly basis, where you are being asked to comply with the very colonial values that not only eclipse rich Indigenous and majority world knowledge, but also serve to hurt you in the system. Being disobedient is not the same as being abrasive, as this can put colleagues with few privileges at risk. Being disobedient means that you can no longer go along with colonial and racist practices that have been demeaning and damaging for decades. There are subtle and more overt ways of challenging those practices. I'm not able to tell you what you should do in your everyday research practices because that's deeply contextual, and you are the best judge of what you are able to do. But also it's because everyone has to do the work to figure out how to challenge the system you're in, especially if you benefit from it. Remember that it's everyone's responsibility, not just Indigenous or majority world researchers' responsibility. And what do I mean by being unfaithful? Again, there is an assumption that this means breaking the rules. In our context, I mean deeply reflecting on unquestioned faithfulness to this established idea of what research means and involves. And with that comes the unquestioned acceptance of dominant research models, the ones others and sometimes we use, the ones we were taught and that our supervisors suggested, and the ones that continue to appear in many research publications. I'm thinking here of the work of Marcella Polenko and colleagues and their article, How to be Unfaithful to Eurocentrism, which is in the journal of the Qualitative Report. I'd like to share a reflection that one of my students wrote in their essay for my course, Decolonising Research Methodologies. They recalled their first sociology class. The professor walked in, took off their shoes, and began walking on the chairs in the lecture theatre. As you can imagine, students were very confused. Their professor used this example to explain that it was important to think outside the box, that there were multiple ways to think about the world, and that it was crucial to think differently. The class felt exciting and different and fresh. However, this student experienced a huge sense of disappointment because all the content remained faithful to traditional sociological theories, even the ones that are known to be hugely problematic. I usually refer to this body of work as pale, male, stale, and mostly dead. What struck me about this student's reflection was that acknowledging that we need to do things differently and to think differently is often followed by perhaps a lack of courage or know-how on being unfaithful. So commitment to what's need to change, it needs to be said, is nowhere near enough and can turn out to be simply tokenistic. So what I'm talking about here is quite different to equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI agendas, or what Dr. Sana Ahsan describes as endless distraction and inaction, or EDI. Or I quote, a vast net with gaping holes that catches very little at all. Nor am I referring to taking small steps in the right direction. I'm following Greta Thunberg's lead to skip and reject such phrases. These won't bring about the deep systemic changes we need in research. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of how I am disobedient and unfaithful. Perhaps as an invitation for you to think about how you can be disobedient and unfaithful. Be disobedient by objecting to tokenism, and be unfaithful by practicing citational justice. So to unpack tokenism, I must split how I address this audience. First, to those of you who consider that you have many privileges. You don't have to think twice when you apply for a job and get a job offer, when you're asked to join a research team or a panel or a committee, about whether you will be in the minority and the extra work that that will involve. How much time do you spend thinking about who else is on the team or panel or committee? If you notice that there is a lack of or else tokenistic representation, what do you do about it? Especially when you stand to benefit from being included. In most cases, you can always say no. You can always say, this is not good enough and I won't participate. You can always encourage organizers or the research team leaders to do the work. I would recommend Professor Lorgia Garcia Peña's book, Community as Rebellion, Surviving Academia as a Woman of Color. Lorgia is a professor of Latinx studies in the US. To try to understand what it's like to be the one, with capital T and capital O. It's difficult to imagine what it feels to be the one if you haven't experienced it firsthand. But this book provides excellent insight into how violent, racist, and humiliating it can be to be treated as a token. Stop tokenism, even if, and especially when it doesn't affect you personally. If you are feeling uncomfortable when you think about these ideas, that's a very good thing. Change is uncomfortable and painful. Sit with this uncomfortableness and pain for a bit and understand why you feel this way. For those of you who have minimal privileges and know all too well what it's like to be the token brown or queer or woman or young person on the team, on the committee, on the panel, when you are the one. We need you in this research community. Don't accept being treated as inferior. Decline such invitations, even if you think it will impact your career prospects or research relationships. There are other ways to progress in academia or as a researcher, even when you think that refusing to be a token will shut down the best opportunities. Expect more from your colleagues and institutions, and don't apologize for that. I would also recommend you read Community as Rebellion, if you haven't yet, because it's a great example of how to manage these tricky situations as a minority without losing yourself or feeling completely isolated. I can tell you that I'm a much better researcher since I no longer accept to be treated as a token brown person on research teams. I sometimes say no to really exciting projects that I want to be part of because I know that my participation will come at great cost to me. But more importantly, it will set a precedent for others who come after me to be treated in the same way. I no longer do the work for my colleagues. That is not up to me. I'd like to mention the importance of citational justice. I recommend Diana Kwan's 2022 article in Nature called The Rise of Citational Justice. Think about who you cite on repeat in your scholarship on creative research projects. Might be me, but perhaps, maybe, but perhaps you are not yet seeing the importance of making a conscious effort to prioritize Indigenous and majority world scholarship in your work. You might believe that you are expected to cite the usual suspects, as Professor Alison Phipps says. Who are those usual suspects in your research context and in your discipline? Whose names are automatically associated with your creative methods? Think about those researchers' backgrounds. Is there a common denominator there? When you search for new resources, think about how much time you spend actually identifying scholarship authored by Indigenous or majority world scholars, who might make the same excellent arguments as white scholars. Do you systematically check the publication for the lead author's institution or country of birth or background? Any statement of positionality? Any explicit commitment to using a decolonial approach in their research? This doesn't take very long. Well, sometimes it does take a bit of work to find the relevant information. But choosing to amplify the scholarship of Indigenous and majority world researchers alongside or sometimes instead of the usual suspects that dominate the scene can go a very long way towards citational justice. The body of knowledge on methodologies will not change significantly if we don't start implementing those practices now and encourage others to do the same. So the discussions we're having at this conference confirm for me that a different research environment is possible and indeed much needed. I stay in academia because I truly believe that change is possible. And even if I'm proved wrong in the long run, there is much work to be done in the meantime to change the norms of colonial and racist research practices. None of us can afford to be complacent and hope that others will do the work for us and fix the system. What I hope my words achieve is a renewed sense of responsibility and that moral obligation to better understand individually and collectively what needs to change in creative research and why, and for you to take action. So to do that, I'm going to stop now for a minute, and I would like to give you some time to write down, if you're able to, on your phone, on your laptop, or your notebook, what you will do from this point forward to be disruptive, that is, to be disobedient and unfaithful. I will give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, a few final words. Whenever you feel uncertain or discouraged, I would like you to have a look at what you've written down and think about how you are progressing with your commitment. It may be that you haven't made any or much progress, or maybe you are on track and kicking goals and thriving. What I want you to remember is that there were roughly 100 plus people in the physical space and 70 plus people online who were with you when you made that commitment. And maybe they're also struggling, or maybe they're also doing well. We're not alone in imagining a different research community. Find and connect with people who want to work together to achieve these goals. Read more. Indigenous and majority world scholars have been telling us for decades what we should be doing differently. Bring this scholarship into your work, not as a tokenistic mention in a publication, but truly think about how these research models can inform your creative practice. Embrace being uncomfortable about change and do it anyway. Like Pam said yesterday, don't be stopped. Before I end, I just want you to do a shameless plug and draw your attention to those little postcards that are available in the policy press stand just outside, which is about the book that I co-edited, Disrupting the Academy with Lived Experience-Led Knowledge. And then there's an incredible discount at the back, so make sure you grab it. This is the kind of scholarship that disrupts the academic spaces, the stuff that Pam and I have been talking about since yesterday. Different ways of sharing knowledge, different ways of even understanding what knowledge is, and of challenging publishers to make sure that they do make this available. So grab one for you or for a friend, and make sure that you decide how you're going to take up the challenges that we set out for you since yesterday. I'm very pleased to have shared these thoughts with you, and I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? It's very close range, this. Yes.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for such an inspired talk. I just wonder to know how you normally deal with peer review process.
How much time do we have?
I know maybe this is a big question, but when you are also talking about the limitation of methods and things like that, and of course, sometimes you deal with peer review that is really Eurocentric.
Yes.
How do you normally approach this kind of things? Yeah.
So I used to cry a lot. I no longer waste my tears on peer review. But over the years, I've learned to identify the journals that will be good homes for my work and the work of the people I value in my network. Even though the institution might tell me that I need to send my publications to such and such journals, that's their narrative, it's not my narrative. So it's important for you to decide individually what your narrative is. Where do you want your work to appear? Open access journals, online journals, where do you think is the best home for that scholarship? And to continue to support those journals and also review for them whenever you're asked. Because the more we do that, the more we will loosen that legitimacy that's been assigned to certain journals. And even if that doesn't happen for me, that doesn't really matter, because when I seek the scholarship I'm after, it's not in those top journals or whatever they're designated in different countries. It's in the journals that have an ethical approach to what they publish, that are concerned about social justice and human rights, that are concerned about supporting early career researchers, researchers from countries where English is not the main language, etc. These are the journals that I want to support. So I can speak from a place of privilege, because when I was a junior researcher, yes, I had to do all that I was told and more. But as I progress, now I can make those choices and I say, no, thank you very much. I'm not interested in following that pathway. I'm following my own path. If I do get a difficult review, I've grown better and better at responding in a way that also educates the reviewer. So remember that reviewers, sometimes it's us and sometimes they don't know, and their review is based on not knowing. And so framing your response in a way that's not antagonistic, but that's knowledge sharing, means that perhaps the second time around there are no changes. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Any more questions from the floor? And then I'm going to take some from our online attendees. Nope. Oh, one more.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I just had I guess a comment and a question about the about cultural safety. Yes. And thinking about I guess some of the sort of budgetary sort of implications around how important it is when thinking about involving potential participants to decide whether a project is something that they see value in and want to be a part of. In terms of that researching for and with, that there's also resource there available to ensure that they're sort of paid for their time. So I'm just thinking about exchange and how that's thought about as part of good, disobedient and anti-colonial and decolonial practice.
So in Australia anyway, that's why a lot of my research is not funded, because all those considerations are super important. That element of reciprocity, so whether it's through payment or it's through supporting in any other way. So for example, a non-payment way of supporting co-researchers is to write together or review something that they're writing, a funding grant, or being present at a community meeting where they want your input. So there's other ways of being, of showing reciprocity. But obviously the best way is for co-researchers to be paid, and sometimes at the same level as me. So whatever my hourly rate is, should be the same rate for a co-researcher. So if I'm serious about it and saying that we are co-researchers and we are equivalent in what we share in terms of our knowledge and to work together, then they should be paid at the same rate. This does not happen institutionally, so we have to find other ways of finding those sources of funding that are more flexible to say that it's a project cost. Actually, it's not nice if you can do it. this is what we start with. The other cost that I've tried to consider in funding applications too is to go to conferences. So funding the places of co-researchers to attend conferences. So I'm not alone in presenting knowledge that I've co-created with a group of people or even with a representative. Again, very difficult to get those kinds of costs covered because it's kind of new and unusual. So, you know, going back to my first point, a lot of what I've put forward is not funded because funders usually go with things they know and understand and that are cost effective, even if you're very good at making an argument that this is essential to the project. Otherwise, the power relationships are the same. I'm getting paid more. I get to go to the conference. I'm publishing. So the other thing that I do as well is co-write publications. So all of this involves much more work than other approaches. But again, if you're serious about those models and if you're serious about saying there is power sharing in the knowledge production process, then all of these considerations have to be taken on board. The best way to know what co-researchers want is to ask them. So the work starts well before even the project exists or even gets funding. That's kind of midway through to get funding and then to execute the project. So all those conversations and those relationships need to be there well before you go anywhere starting a project formally.
Thank you so much. Couple of questions online. One from Nicolette, which I think is up here. She says, thank you so much for this. How do you navigate when participants themselves reify colonial structures or ideologies on one thing while trying to decolonize another?
Ooh, that's an excellent question, Nicolette. I'm always excited when co-researchers and participants identify the very things I struggle with. I feel less alone and I feel more energized to work even harder on the project. There's always an understanding with anyone I collaborate in that way that no project is perfect and we discover issues and complexities as we go. And the commitment is to identify and address those issues and not ignore them or brush them under the carpet. So I can't pretend that there is a model that works to addressing all those complexities all at once. It's a matter of being agile and flexible and being able to listen even when it hurts, because sometimes it might have been something that I've done or that my institution has done. So it's really important to be open to the potential of having a conversation that will reveal painful experiences, and then that the relationship is in place that we can decide together how best to address the situation. I definitely don't call myself an expert. I don't go in pretending that I have the answers. I definitely do not. And that is something that I guess reduces over time. I definitely feel less and less like the person who has answers. I'm very happy to be guided by what co-researchers want to address and how they want to address it.
Thank you. One more question from online. As you can see, you've touched on the fact that a lot of your research proposals are not funded. Daniela Fernandez says, how can we also challenge the funding systems which replicate colonial racist practices? How do we make them understand that research questions need to come from communities and not as a result of funding topics?
Daniela, I don't know. It's a big question because it's such a big problem. It's trying to challenge something that's been done in a particular way for decades and trying to show that there are other possibilities and that those possibilities actually work. There's so much reticence and fear about trying different models when money is involved. And sometimes there is quite a bit of freedom to do unfunded research because there's that's taken out of the equation, that pressure. What I could say is that if you have a community of similar-minded people and you all have the same strategies, by chipping away in different contexts in every application, mentioning the same strategies, making sure that it becomes something that's known then to funders and organizations that, okay, it's not just Caroline saying this works. It's actually 100 other people saying you need to fund co-researchers to the same level as the lead applicant, for example. Then we can start to see some changes. But I think we also have to be realistic. I don't want us to leave today thinking, you know, super inspired that we're going to go and change the world. There are some structures that are so entrenched that it's going to take a lot of time. Perhaps we won't see the changes that we're after. Doesn't mean we should work hard towards those changes, but I think it's important to be realistic that sometimes it's an accumulated impact over time. We have to be the ones to start it if it's not there already. And the generation that comes afterward, us or generations, will then take over, and this will become their norm. This will become their norm, and then that can be reinforced. And slowly, I think the systems can change. But I don't want this to be the main motivator of changing major systems that are so rigid and difficult to influence. But it will happen, but over time, I think.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, right at the back. The exercise.
Really? So yeah, thank you, Caroline. It's really, really interesting and informative, and a great reminder that I think we need on a regular basis. Just a question about when you find yourself working in institutions that are not on their anti-racist journey yet, with colleagues who have avoided it or managed to for a long time, and the woundings that you experience when you're in that situation. How do you recover?
I don't recover. I don't think the aim is to recover. I think the aim is to identify just how hurtful it is and what work we need to do to change the system. I don't think that you can recover from some of the humiliation and violence that those systems impose upon us, because it benefits most people, and they don't see any aim, any purpose in changing the system. But I think within those rigid structures, there are opportunities for micro universities or micro research communities. And I have to say, even though Twitter is no longer what it was, I've found a community of similar-minded people on Twitter. And I really miss that, actually. I really miss that, because that community beyond the walls of the institution, that's the community that sustains the work, not the community within the walls of the institution that benefits from the status quo. Does that make sense? So that's why I think it's really important to know who your people are. So whether it's people in this group or in other transnational settings or in community settings, sometimes there is much more support in community-based work and collaborations than in institutional work. And, you know, when I say I don't recover, I don't mean to discourage you. I just mean that it's important also not to forget what damage an institution can do to people and continues to do. And like I said, I've got many privileges, and I know that the damage can be much deeper and profound on other people who don't have as many privileges than me. So it's important not to forget and to decide what kind of legacy we want to leave for the next generation. And draw on that, draw on the power of exclusion and and humiliation and being hurt to decide, well, what kind of environments do I want to leave for the next generation? How do I ensure that within that system that's so difficult and rigid, that there are still pockets of joy and support and kindness and reciprocity? And then I really enjoy that much more. I really value that much more.
Thank you. Well, what a wonderful session. Can I just thank you? You've got one question?
No, I was just thinking we've only got time for one more, but
one more quick one.
Please, I think it's a small one, but
I will keep it
sharp.
It's thank you for this, and it's just a follow-up with a follow-on with what you've just shared in terms of finding our people and finding a community to be working with. But I do wonder, in the longer from a longer time perspective, does that not run the risk of furthering the silos in some ways? How do we sort of navigate that? That's not the intention, but then if we are sort of working in a community that supports what we want outside the institutions we want to change,
Yes.
maybe there's some sort of a risk involved there?
There definitely is a risk, but that's not a risk that we chose. It's a risk that's been imposed on us. It's a risk that we have to respond to because of how the situation is. Ideally, what we should be doing is burning everything down and rebuilding, okay? That's what we should be doing. I should have started with that. But because we can't necessarily do that at this point in time, we never know what could happen in the future. We still have to find ways to sustain ourselves and support each other because of the situation we've been placed into. And you're absolutely right. That's not ideal. But this is probably one of the best situations we have, or strategies or tactics that we have to regroup and then slowly try to burn things down if we can. Title for the next keynote. Burn everything down.
Thank you so much. Can I thank you all for your engagement with this session and the online attendees as well. It's just working so brilliantly. I can't believe it. So another big thank you to Caroline.